Great. Thank you. Again, I'm honored to be asked to come talk with you and spend a little bit of time with you. And I know some of you were here earlier, so you've already spent a few hours with me. So hopefully we'll give you something a little bit different. However, there's going to be just a little bit of repeat at the beginning because I'm going to give you my message again about this idea of purposeful teaching. And I think that was great to have these comments from your president, as we're fond of saying too, that sometimes it feels like preaching to the choir when you're doing work like this, where you're talking to people that already are really intentional and thoughtful about their teaching. But as they say, the choir always is practicing, right? The choir needs practice. So that's great that all of you are coming together to kind of keep thinking about your teaching and be the best teachers that you can be and the most thoughtful. So this morning, or I guess lunchtime, earlier today, we were talking a little bit about how the education environment can feel a little bit overwhelming with a lot of the messages that you get about different kinds of teaching. And so it can feel a little bit like you're overwhelmed with ideas and concepts and active learning, inquiry-based teaching, learner-centered teaching, all these things that you know you're supposed to be doing, or that you're getting the message that you are, but then where do you turn and what are the things that are most useful. So that's what we spent a little time talking about this morning. And I asked the group earlier what kinds of decisions they make when they decide what teaching methods to use. And we talked a little bit about how, as faculty members, we're often pretty good at looking at our courses, looking at the content, all the different things that we need to cover and address and teach in our courses, and we break it up by weeks. But when it comes down to what we actually do in the classroom, we kind of base those decisions on certain things like we do what we liked when we were students. We do the types of methods that were always done in our teaching areas when we were a grad student. Classes were run this certain way, and that's what we end up doing. We sometimes do things that look like what teaching is supposed to be about, these popular images of the teacher in front of the classroom. And so we think of all those things, but there aren't really a lot of frameworks that help us decide, okay, these are some of the goals I have in my class. Now, what's the most effective or what's the most appropriate method for me to choose to use today? It's Tuesday, I'm going into class, I really want to teach students this skill-based concept. What am I going to do? Am I going to lecture? Am I going to do a role play? Am I going to do group work or discussion? Of all the various things that we can do, how do we make those decisions? And so that's the framework that I've worked on with my colleague Jim Davis that Elizabeth mentioned. And it's not the end-all be-all. I get that there's different ways that all of us conceptualize teaching and learning, but it's one that has really rung true for me, and I think hopefully it can be helpful for you as well to think about the goals that you have for your students and then to connect those to the most useful teaching methods. So the message that I have again that we talked about all morning and that we'll talk about again now is this idea to just be as purposeful as possible. So how do we really connect kind of what's underlying the type of teaching and learning that we're doing with our particular goals and our strategies? So I'm going to start by asking you to fill out a sheet that hopefully everyone has a copy of at your tables. It looks like this. On one side it says what I hope my students learn, and on the other side 7 ways of learning overview. So these are two sides to the same coin, and I'm going to ask you to check off those things for a particular course that you hope your students do. Now, for those of you that were here earlier and you actually already did this, you could take step 2, which would be to think about the amount of time that your students have to spend on your class. You know that they're only going to spend so many hours of their life working on your class. Of all that time, what percentage of that time do you hope they spend in these different ways? So you can almost put a little percentage next to each of these boxes that are appropriate for your class. You know, I hope that they spend 30% of their time on this aspect or 20% of my time on a different one. So I'll give you a minute to look through that. So you can continue to fill that out as we go through this session, but I wanted to give you a little time to really think about it and focus on it. These are pretty generic statements about what kind of learning people may do across different disciplines. And again, as we mentioned this morning, some of it, when I say critical thinking, I may be talking about something a little bit different than what you think, but what you can use on this backside is where you see the bubbles where it talks about different ways of learning and different teaching strategies. That's where we're connecting these goals that we have with our students with some very effective teaching methods to use for those goals. So you might look at the match within your own classes, again, and for those of you that went to the next level of looking at percentage of time, one of the common things that I hear from faculty members who actually kind of walk through this framework is, wow, well, I really want my students to be doing some of these other things on here, but I realize I'm directing a lot of their time at tasks that maybe aren't where I really want them to be spending most of their time. So how can I intentionally kind of refocus some of their time through my own teaching methods? So as it's useful, hopefully you can use this framework to help you kind of guide that for your classes. So this morning we talked about two of these ways of learning. We talked specifically about critical thinking and creative thinking. Oh, no, I'm sorry, that's what we're doing today. We talked about problem solving and decision-making abilities, which is what we call learning through mental models, and this idea of how you teach for problem solving and decision-making by giving people frameworks and really focusing on the process. And then we also talked about group work and how oftentimes we want to teach students certain things where they need to be able to look at different perspectives and different ways of thinking about something and the benefits and the pros and cons and the challenges of using group work. So what we're going to do now is look at two others, one of them being critical thinking and creative thinking. So how many of you on this sheet checked off that third box there where it says critical thinking or creative thinking? How many of you checked that off as something that you do in your classes? So almost everybody, which is what I would have expected. The other one we're going to talk about is the last one on there, personal growth, self-discovery, real-world experiences through reflection. How many of you checked that off as something you do in your classes? So another good group in here. Those are the two that we're really going to hit on over the next hour or so, but before we do that, I wanted to talk about one more quickly, because one of these, what we call ways of learning, is about presenting and explaining and lecturing, if you will. And I'm sure that some of you right now are sitting there going, okay, she's telling us to do all these different things, but she's standing up lecturing to us. So how does that compute? What's the connection? So I want to kind of address that first, because as someone who comes from a Center for Teaching and Learning, sometimes I think you're expecting the message of you should never ever lecture, and that's nothing that we ever want to do again in colleges and universities. And actually, that's not the message that we have here. The message is really we need to understand what presenting and explaining, we use those words instead of the word lecture because the word lecture has a lot of connotations to it. But what are the values? What's happening when we're presenting and explaining, and how do we understand where that's useful and where perhaps it's not as useful? So this way of learning is one thing that we call acquiring knowledge, because it's really the second and third on your sheet here. Knowledge about a field of study or a basic understanding of concepts and ideas. This is what we would consider to be presenting, explaining, lecturing, where oftentimes in a class you have the need or the goal to give students concepts, ideas, give them basic understanding. And that can be done in a variety of ways. It can also be done through readings, through videos, through other methods. But if you're doing it as a teaching method, this is a place where simply telling students, explaining to them, makes a lot of sense. So lectures are definitely something that have been part of higher education, part of colleges for a long time. This morning we looked at a study from the sciences that really looked at active learning and some of the tremendous benefits of active learning over lecture. But again, there are some times when this way of learning makes a lot of sense. And for this way of learning, we draw on a lot of the theories from cognitive psychology, so we're looking at attention and information processing and memory specifically. And what we know is that when we are presenting, first of all, we have to have people's attention. And I don't know about your campus. At my campus, we struggle a lot with digital devices nowadays in the classroom, and the incredible distraction that those can cause. I mean, they're really designed to take our attention. And so what we can do in the classroom to kind of help redirect and get students' attention. But essentially, if you're presenting information, your students aren't paying attention, that's kind of one of the first rules. We could talk all sorts about multitasking, what's now called switch tasking, and some of the limits of our attention. But for purposes of this, we'll just say that we really need attention if we want presentations to be effective. The other aspects of this are really that this way of learning happens much better if the people we are talking to have a lot of prior experience, prior knowledge in the areas that we're talking about, and if the material is presented in context and with meaning. So as we learn new information, we kind of put it in the structures that we've created in our heads. And if that's pretty sparse, if we don't have a lot of prior knowledge about something, we're just taking in all this information as new information, new things, and we can't really sort out what's important versus what is not as important. So if we're presenting to a group that has a lot of prior knowledge, it's much easier for them to retain that information and to learn from it. So you can imagine a lot of you probably go to conferences in your disciplines, in your fields. You can go to talk after talk after talk and learn a lot, but you have a lot of prior knowledge. It's all taken in context. You're kind of determining what this means to your own research agenda, to your own classes, to your own teaching. And there's a lot of meaning there. You're really motivated to be there. Obviously, you're paying attention. Usually, you're going there partially out of your own time and energy to spend that time. So you have a lot of things that we don't always have in the classroom when you're at a conference. So you can learn a lot from those different talks that you might have where it's not quite the same situation that we have in our classrooms. But what are the limits of this way of learning that we call presenting and explaining? And this is where I want to make clear that although when we present information, it can be very useful and beneficial to our audience, we're not teaching skills. We're not teaching students how to collaborate. We're not helping them practice their critical thinking or develop certain kinds of awareness or judgment or skill development. Really, we're giving them information that will help them go on and be able to do that, but they're not going to learn it alone through a lecture. So right now, I'm giving you, hopefully, some ideas and some information over the next little bit of time that you can then take back and help inform your practice, but that alone is not going to help you develop a skill or think more, develop your critical thinking abilities. So again, just to understand kind of the limits of this way of learning is part of the key. So lecturing, not all bad, but it's useful for certain kinds of purposes. But the two that we're going to talk about today, and again, we'll save some time at the end, but if you have any examples you want to share or questions that you want to ask at any time, please go ahead. This one will be much shorter than the session we did earlier today. But the two that we're going to jump into today, one is this idea of critical thinking and creative thinking. And I'm really going to focus in on the critical thinking aspect, because that's, I think almost everybody in here raised their hand when they said that's part of what they teach in their classes. And so one of these, what we call ways of learning, is this idea of teaching students to become better thinkers. And we could spend a lot of time talking about the different definitions of critical thinking. We even break it down into dialogical thinking and creative thinking, but what we'll talk about today is more aligned with critical thinking. And for that, we call this learning through inquiry, because we look a lot at discussions and inquiry-based teaching, and we're able to make a pretty strong connection between those teaching methods and these learning goals. So I'll give you the example here. So what is critical thinking? And I'm not sure if any of you have trouble seeing that, but if we look at a number of different definitions of critical thinking in general, and I recognize that within specific disciplines, you may have very specific ways that you think about and talk about critical thinking, but in general, those scholars who kind of talk about critical thinking talk about some different components of what makes critical thinking. So when somebody is thinking critically, there's a certain awareness of their own thinking, that when thinking is sort of left to itself, it can be fairly biased, it can be pretty prejudiced, it can be very narrow in a sense. And so teaching someone critical thinking is teaching them to have this awareness of their own thinking, of their own biases, of their own assumptions. So a key piece of that is the awareness. The other piece is for the students to have some sort of reflection on their teaching. So they're actually working towards improving their thinking, becoming a better thinker. So they have that awareness, and then they're using it to improve their thinking in some way. And it's also talked about being a process, that we're developing a habit of mind when we're teaching critical thinking. So we're teaching students to continually analyze something, question something, think about it differently. So it's really a developing in students a habit, a set of skills, and then a habit of using those skills. So that's some general definitions of critical thinking. Now let's look at what happens when you're involved in a discussion. And there's lots of different ways to do discussion. I'll talk a little bit about online discussions, but for the most part, we'll be talking about classroom-based discussions. So in a discussion, what you're doing is you're engaging with other people, usually a variety of people with different viewpoints, ideally, and you have to, first of all, articulate your thinking. So you have to actually put it in words. You have to put it in writing or say it in a complete sentence if you can. So you're actually having to formulate that. And if you think back to the definition of critical thinking, of that awareness, this is a piece that fits nicely here, where you just simply have to say what you're thinking. You gain feedback on your thinking by getting hearing what other people say, how they maybe agree with or challenge your ideas, but even just body language. If you see people shaking their heads and agreeing with you, or non-verbally disagreeing with you, you get that feedback on your ideas and your own thinking process. And you become aware of others' ideas, obviously, and hopefully when you're in a discussion, you're talking with other people. So the more that other people share their ideas, you hear different things. If I were to ask kind of an open-ended discussion question to this group, we'd have 30 or 40 different responses, different ways of thinking about that. And so that's the benefit of the discussion. And so you're able to kind of rephrase and rethink your ideas. So if we put these two together, hopefully what we see is a pretty strong connection, that if we're engaged in discussion, we're doing a lot of things that fit under the definition of critical thinking. The awareness piece, the getting feedback piece, the reflection on our thinking, and then hopefully where the instructor comes in is helping guide students towards better and more sophisticated ways of thinking. So that's kind of the connection, but we'll talk a little bit about some best practice of running discussions. But first of all, we don't have a huge group, so I hope some of you would feel comfortable sharing. When you're engaged in discussions, they're also pretty hard sometimes. They can be difficult, and it can feel very uneasy to run discussions because you kind of give over control to the students. So what are some of the challenges that some of you face, or that you think are common challenges when you're engaged in a discussion? Mm-hmm. Which in a classroom is great. Somebody can just nod their head, but online they'll say, "Ooh, I got my discussion posted." And that's not, doesn't quite count. What's
So in an in-class discussion, like the one example I think of, I have one particular student who answers every single question, like they're just, and all the rest of the class just looks at them, like waiting for them to answer the question. It's hard to get a discussion going when you have someone who sort of dominates.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want them to give up. I like the participation.
Mm-hmm. But sort of the uneven levels of participation, the over-talkers. And the,
I think the lack of foundational knowledge, or the unsure, like the students are unsure of their level of knowledge, they won't contribute.
mm-hmm.
They're wanting you to tell them the answer. They don't want to say something maybe you will disagree with, or that is wrong.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts? I think what a lot of these have in common, not all of them, some of it's about kind of uneven levels, but a lot of these kind of get to really getting deeper kinds of discussions. That one of the criticisms of discussions that they can stay at a pretty surface level. And so how do we get our discussions to really get to those more interesting layers of critical thinking? And so I'm going to share with you actually another framework that I have found useful in my own work, and hopefully you can take something from it too, about how we can get our discussions to focus a little bit more intentionally on critical thinking. So some of the keys to this, one is have a plan, and I know that either sounds very intuitive or maybe counterintuitive, because I know when I first started doing discussions, it was a lot of like, I come up with a question and then I'm going to throw it out and then we'll talk about it for 20 minutes and then we'll go move on to this. And I didn't really spend the time thinking about what would actually happen in that discussion. And that's something that I really learned when I started looking at the literature, is how great it is to spend some time really thinking through what possibly is going to happen in this discussion. I like this graphic because it shows you that there is never going to be, you know, I ask this question, they respond in this way, and then I jump back in here. You know, it's never going to be that great linear model that we want. Students are going to take it all over the place. I often start with kind of a warm-up question, and then I always have that student who takes it right to the very end of where I wanted to end the discussion. So I have to say, that's great, but let's back up and let's start with the question I really just asked, which was getting you to warm up. So sometimes you have to really spend a lot of time redirecting, but I have found it really helpful to spend some time thinking about where I want the discussion to go. What are those 2 or 3 key things that I want to make sure that we touch on? And if they don't come up organically from the students, that's where I can look back and say, hey, okay, we've got 10 minutes left. I really want to make sure we touch on this issue because it hasn't come up yet. Or I can tell if we're spending way too much time over here, I can kind of bring us back and say, this is really useful, but I want to make sure we redirect this a little bit. So it helps me as a facilitator to really kind of think through where I want the discussion to end up. And it never ends up exactly the right way, but having that plan has really helped. So the framework that I wanted to share with you actually comes from the literature about online classes. And I'll give you all the background for those that are interested, but there's something called the Community of Inquiry model. I don't know if anybody's heard of that. But it's a model that has tried to look, it's actually a number of researchers in Canada who did a national study. They were nationally funded for about 10 years to kind of look at online courses and look at what makes for kind of quality discourse in an online class. And so they broke it into, you may have heard of this, these ideas of social presence, teaching presence, and cognitive presence. And what we're going to look at right now is just the cognitive presence aspect of it. So this is also called the practical inquiry model, and I can give anyone further references to any of this if you'd like. But they talk about these 4 stages of what they call critical discourse in an online class, but what we could just, for simplicity's sake, call getting students to get to deeper levels of critical thinking. And I realize this graphic is hard to read. Don't worry about the words. The point is just that even though I'm going to talk about this as kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, it's very iterative, and some of this happens in this cycle and a lot of it doesn't. But the point is that all of these things kind of build on each other. But in an ideal world, having this kind of discussion would start with a good triggering event. And this I stole from Stephen Brookfield, this idea of what makes for a good triggering event. And it's something where students have both the ability and the motivation to respond. And I know that that sounds pretty simple, but if you really think about it and you analyze your own triggering events, your own discussion starters, if you will, this is where I do think sometimes we can be off a little bit. I know I always try to aim high. I'm always wanting to start off at this super high level discussion, and then I have to sort of back up and say, okay, they may not have the ability to start there. Maybe I need to start with kind of an earlier warm-up question and hopefully build there. So you want to make sure they have the ability, but also the motivation. And I've talked with one instructor who was very honest and said, I think I have the most interesting discussion questions, but when I finally asked my students, they did not. They did not think they were very interesting. So I had to try to find ways to make this something that they were really interested and motivated to participate in. Of course, you want the question to be open-ended, not kind of something where there's one answer, what they call guess what I'm thinking questions, where there's a right or wrong. It's sufficiently difficult, sufficiently open-ended. I'll just give you one example, which I personally stole from my colleague Jim Davis, but I teach a class about adult learning theory. And one of my favorite triggers is just to start the class off with an icebreaker where they talk about, they introduce themselves and then they say when they became an adult. So the question is simply, when did you become an adult? And we spend a lot of time on that. People have these great stories. They have the ability to answer that question. There's usually some that they bring up a specific event or something that happened in their lives, or maybe it's a series of responsibilities that built up over time. There's always a few students. In this class, it's mostly older non-traditional students, but there's always a few that say, I don't really think I'm an adult yet, and here's why. So everybody can respond to that, and it's pretty motivating because it's very personal, but from there we just launch right into a discussion about what is an adult? Is it an event? Is it a set of responsibilities? You know, what makes that, how can we define an adult? And then when we start looking at learning theory, we start the discussion around, you know, why are adults different than other kinds of learners? What makes adult learning theory different? So it's a really natural lead into a much richer discussion. But if you think about what might make for good triggering question stems, sometimes, again, if you're thinking about this idea of ability and motivation, one good idea is just what are your initial reactions? If you pose something, a case or an example, some people will show videos or give kind of a problem, something that came up in the news. I think it's nice to start with these kind of warm-ups that are really, what do you think about that? There's no wrong answer to what are your initial reactions. You know, you kind of getting back to Elizabeth's question, you don't have to be right when that's the trigger. You just have to share. But these are some other examples. To imagine something, what would you do? How would you describe? To get people started. These are pretty easy ones. I've heard some really wonderful ones from other instructors in terms of really getting students started. And I don't know if any of you have any to share either now or as we discuss later, but if you have a great trigger that you've used, please share it at some point today. But if we move along with this model, assuming that we have this kind of sufficiently engaging triggering event, the next stage that we would move into is this idea of exploration. And according to the theorists behind this model, exploration is where we're simply kind of brainstorming, we're sharing personal ideas. It's kind of this information exchange period where you might hear things that look like this, like I think, I tend to, you know, I was sort of forming the opinion that, so it's a very tentative kind of first run at a discussion. This reminds me of, and this is where you might hear some things that honestly can sound a little awkward, because again, if we think about taking in new ideas and putting them in with the structures we've developed in our brains, if we don't have a lot of structure there around the content area, this is where you might hear students say like, well, this reminds me of my cousin's friend's brother who had this one experience, and you're thinking that's not really what I'm talking about, but that's what they're connecting it to. So at least you're getting a sense of what they're thinking and what their prior knowledge is. So some exploration question stems. This is where if you want to get more from this stage, you're probably going to want to ask them for clarification. So you might be asking things like, can you restate that? Or can you tell me more about that? Or can you give me an example of what's going on? You also probably want to ask for more evidence. This is where you want to start helping students be able to back up their questions, back up their statements, back up their rationale. So can someone find evidence, or how do you know that? And then you also want to make sure that you're seeking other viewpoints, because you want to be sharing different ideas. And so this is where if they're not naturally coming up, you want to make sure to be asking for, what about the other side, or what are we missing? Could anyone share a different viewpoint? Could anyone play devil's advocate and speak for the other side of this? So in this exploration stage, this is where we're just sharing these very initial ideas, information, and viewpoints. And this is where a lot of the studies that have been done that have used this framework have found that most discussions tend to stay at this stage, at this kind of exploration stage. So again, depending on how you look at it, this may be where we say if we want our discussions to go a little bit deeper, they don't naturally get there. This is where they tend to be if we're just throwing out a question for discussion. But to get to those next levels, we have to intentionally probe a little bit more. So the next stage being integration. And this is what these researchers talk about in terms of, this is where students are starting to connect ideas with each other. They're starting to make those connections. So this is really where we start talking more about these kind of real layers of critical thinking. So you'll see students start building on each other, or you'll start to see some synthesis. So I'll give you a couple examples from a class that I've taught, that this is a study that I did. So don't worry necessarily about the content here, but I just highlighted in red kind of where you start to see these identifying cues of integration start to happen. So in this example, a student is saying, you know, now I'm starting to think it may be hard to classify people this way. They talk a little bit more, you know, for example, one of the other students, Naomi, mentioned this, plus the Huel reading says something else. So they're starting to kind of visually pull together a couple of different ideas. Another example is, I've noticed when I focus blah, 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 this makes me think about a question that another student brought up, and then you'll see, maybe we do change as we age. So they're starting to throw out those kind of tentative solutions based on multiple viewpoints and multiple resources. So again, integration is this stage where we usually are wanting them to get to when we're wanting more critical thinking, but we have to really probe for that. So this is where we can talk about how do these ideas relate to each other. Or you might ask questions where you're specifically saying, well, some say this and some say that. What do you think? Or how can we reconcile these? How do we put them together? Or where do we have agreement? Where do we have disagreement? Which idea is more valuable? And we also want to start testing those initial assumptions. So if they're throwing out some idea, well, this is what I think, under what circumstances would that hold up? So they can start going from the tentative solutions to more permanent ones. And then the fourth and final stage in this model is this idea of resolution. This is kind of the wrap up. This is where people are starting to really construct a framework or come away with their viewpoint, their idea of thinking about whatever it is the issue was. And this is one that the literature would say rarely happens in our discussions. And I think we could take that two ways. We could look at it negatively or positively. We could say, well, on one hand, maybe we're not getting to this level because we're not pushing enough, we're not probing enough, we're not intentional enough. But you could also argue that maybe this isn't always where discussions are meant to be or where they end up. I'm a big fan, and I've seen a lot of instructors that are doing more kind of in and out of class work, where maybe you put a blog post up first that gets that kind of early exploration, your personal narrative out there, and then in class we start pulling those together, and then it's followed up with a reflection piece, or you pull that together in a paper that you do later. And that's where the resolution comes. So it's possible that resolution doesn't necessarily have to come in a discussion, but for some of you and what you teach, if you think about the goals of your discussion, if you want them to get to these higher levels, the message would probably be that you have to be pretty intentional and be probing for it, that it doesn't naturally get there. Again, of course, it varies depending on what kinds of students you have and all of that, but I think the idea is to, as much as possible, to probe for that. So a few other things about discussions. This is just an analogy that I love that I've, again, stolen from a guy named Robert Collison, but this idea that facilitating a discussion is almost like making popcorn in a microwave. That if you think about the kernels as ideas that students are popping, if you're cooking that popcorn and you stop it too soon, you have all these kernels that didn't get a chance to pop. Meaning if you're facilitating a discussion and you're jumping in there too quickly, or you're sharing your own opinion, your own viewpoint, there again is literature to show that once the instructor kind of says what they think about a topic, students tend to stop thinking about it so much. And you could even be saying, I really want you to think about this, this is great, but I don't agree. They tend to just say, well, I don't need to really worry about it anymore. But if you're kind of holding back a little bit and they don't know what you think, even though it can be very frustrating for students, I actually had done a study where we interviewed students on this, and it's really frustrating. They want to know what the instructor thinks, but they report to do a lot more thinking about it because they don't know what the instructor thinks about this or what the instructor's viewpoint is. So you want to kind of hold back a little bit in your discussions, especially on areas where you want them to be exploring these different viewpoints. But to take the popcorn analogy the other way, if we let it go too long, then you get kind of that burnt popcorn smell that sort of stays around for a long time. So you don't want the students to spend too much time going down the wrong path or exploring something that isn't useful, that isn't kind of the best use of their time. So it is a balance. It is kind of a bit of an artwork to be able to know how much to jump in and how much to stay out. So that's something that we all need to navigate a little bit. The other two pieces, one is that we just want to create a climate where students are really encouraged to practice their thinking. And the reason I have a picture of a piano up there is because if you think about teaching students to play the piano, very early on as they're learning, it can sound not so great as you're listening to it. There's a lot of miscues, there's missed notes, the timing isn't great, and so a lot of times when we're listening to that, it doesn't sound wonderful. And if you take that and apply it to teaching students thinking skills in the classroom, some of what they say might not sound that great. They may be way off. They may be thinking at a very superficial level. They may not be making these connections that are kind of obvious to you, but that's how they're learning. Those are just those first early stages, those early tinklings of learning how to develop this skill. So as much as we can, to be patient with that and to see our role as guiding the students. And finally, just as a wrap up of this, it's this idea of knowing what the thinking process is, knowing where those misconceptions are that students will run into, anticipate that. And then I'm trying to find the right word for this. We used to always talk about creating a safe space for learning, and especially for discussions. It was about creating discussion norms and getting everyone comfortable, and creating this what we call safe space. But I've talked to enough people lately who have said, there is no safe space for some students on campus, or learning is not always something that is safe and comfortable. So I'm really trying to find a better word right now. I'm kind of going with brave space, that we create a space where students are encouraged to be brave and to share their thoughts. I've talked a lot with a faculty member on our campus who spent most of his years in undergraduate as one of very few African-American males in predominantly white institutions. And he says, my whole undergraduate career was not safe. I was never safe in a classroom. I never felt that way. So how can we make our spaces one where everybody is at least comfortable enough to be brave, to want to share their ideas, without making it so comfortable that we're not learning as well? So again, another balance that I think we need to share. So that's kind of a framework and a lot of ideas around discussions. And I'm going to move on to the other piece, but I did want to pause for a moment and hear any questions that you might have about facilitating discussions, any other things that maybe you do in your class that work really well, or concerns or burning questions that you have about those kinds of discussions that you have. Yeah. Yeah. That's certainly a good one. I don't know if everybody could hear that, but this idea of if students are in a class where they don't really, it's a required class, right? Perhaps a non-major class. They don't have that motivation easy. It doesn't come easy for them. And I'd love to hear other ideas. I wish I had the silver bullet for that one. But again, going back to the triggering event, this idea of the motivation and ability to respond. Without knowing what all of you teach, wondering if there are ways to make this kind of relevant to the students, to make it about something that they care about. We have an instructor at our school who teaches biology, non-major, high enrollment, big class, and she's really turned it around to be focused just on kind of the relevant issues. She actually threw out the textbook. I'm not saying, start all from scratch tomorrow, but she turned it around to where the class is really focused on these big issues of the day. For example, we had some legislation in Colorado recently about GMOs, banning GMOs. And so she took that as kind of the first thing they did and said, how are you going to vote on this issue? Do you need to know anything about biology? And sort of backtracked it from there to focus on what do we need to know about biology to even be able to be informed enough to focus on this. So one way, perhaps, is as much as possible getting the relevance in there. The other is helping students as much as possible kind of see what the benefits are for them long term. What is this class going to be able to provide for them or do for them later on? We talked a little bit this morning, too, about resistance to things like group work and talking about the sales pitch that a lot of faculty members need to do. And unfortunately, I think that is a little bit of what we do in our classes now, is give the students this sales pitch of why is this important, why is this relevant to you? And one thing that we talked about this morning was this idea of what are the kinds of skills that students want to have when they graduate? This is a repeat for some of you, but do they want to be really good at listening? Do they want to be really good at taking notes? Do they want to be really good at multiple choice exams? Or do they want to be really good at, collaborating and creating things and going through these complex decision-making frameworks? So how do we get the students to kind of see, here's the things that are important for me later on in life that I'm going to get out of this class, and helping them make that connection. So those are a few thoughts. If others have great ideas about this, you might even ask the students to come up with some of the triggering events or the discussion questions. I've seen people do that too, where here's the readings for this week. A different group of students every week are responsible with coming up with the relevance. What's a good discussion question based on this week's reading? Or having them even facilitate some discussions. So those are some thoughts. Any others? I'm going to go ahead and move on to the other piece that we're going to look at today, which is this idea of reflecting on experience. And so this is a way of learning that kind of has some similarities to learning through inquiry, but this is what we really call experiential learning. And there's lots of different ways to define what is called experiential learning. And Elizabeth and I were even talking about this earlier today, that a lot of things can kind of be lumped under this idea of experiential learning. But the way that we talk about it specifically are these things that you go out and do in the world that are usually outside of the classroom, where they're engaged in something kind of pretty systemic or something pretty structured, some learning experience that gives them real-world experience. So internships, study abroad, service learning are kind of three of the big ones that fit under this way of learning. And the key is really this reflecting on experience. So giving them this experience and allowing them to reflect on it. And so just a few of the keys that go with this. One is really setting appropriate goals. Obviously want to create the right environment and match students appropriately, but helping students set goals can be a real make or break for some of these experiences. I have seen where students just kind of go off and engage in something and come back and they have various different kinds of learning, which isn't in itself bad, but usually we're pretty limited by time and we have some pretty specific objectives that we want students to get out of these experiences. So helping the students set their own learning goals can be pretty important. Again, at our university, we have externships in the law school. That's one of the examples that I've looked at. And the students there have to write a learning agenda plan before they start. So they have a 2-page, almost like a contract, because this is law school, about what they intend to do, what they hope to get out of it. They look at certain things like what skills might they be lacking? What are the things they're worried about, that they're nervous about? And then they go ahead and start developing some plans around how can they account for that. They can talk about what things they're excited about, what's going to be most challenging, and also to think about what will success look like. What does a student hope will happen by the end of this? And you may have some different goals than your students in this way of learning. Sometimes it may be just general awareness of other cultures, of other kinds of things that are hard to kind of really narrow down into specific objectives, but that's important as well, to recognize and articulate those kinds of goals and help the students see them as well. Other aspects of this are really giving the students appropriate orientation or preparation. Again, you usually don't notice this until this has happened and it's not there. And sometimes when you're doing a new experience, it may take a few times before you really get a sense of, understanding that the students need a little bit more support here. They need a little bit more cultural sensitivity training before they go out and do this work. They might need a little bit more skill development before they're really set off in this new environment, this new experience. But as much as you can to think through those things ahead of time and with the students can help. And then the part that I really wanted to talk about is this idea of reflection. There's this great saying in service learning that, without the reflection piece, service learning is just service. It's really the reflecting on learning that makes it a learning experience. So you want to make sure to provide for this ongoing reflection, periodic review, and then some sort of final review. So let's talk about reflection for just a little bit. This is a quote that I love from John Dewey, and I'll read it quickly. I know not everybody can see this clearly, but he says, "The function of reflective thought is therefore to transform a situation in which there is experienced," so when you're in an experience, obscurity, doubt, conflict, disturbance of some sort, into a situation that is clear, coherent, settled, and harmonious. And so it's this idea that we reflect because we want to kind of make peace in our own minds. And so when we experience something that is new to us, that is perhaps even disturbing to us, that throws us off a little bit, we reflect in order to create some harmony in our own minds. And again, going back to critical thinking, left to ourselves, we don't always perhaps reflect in the most effective ways. This is where I think instructors can really play a key role in helping students take that obscurity, that doubt, and often through frameworks or through some of the things that you want to teach, help the students see that and turn it into reflection that is leading them towards more sophisticated ways of thinking about it. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. Someone that we interviewed for this book, Ruth Benedier, is from the University of Cincinnati, and she talks about, she does study abroad experiences, and she says, when we used to give students the prompt, just, reflect on your experience, when students are asked to reflect, they get stuck at describe. That it can be very hard to get past that, that initial kind of, here's what I saw, and actually looking at it from a pretty ethnocentric view, that they would see a lot of students reflect on things they saw in a new culture that were different, and actually come away feeling a little bit less culturally sensitive than when they started, because they would see, this is weird, this is different, I'm uncomfortable here, and they're trying to create that harmony, so they might just come away with the sense of, this is weird, as opposed to really seeing it, this is just a different way of doing things. So she really structures her prompts to get students to work through that. Her goals are to get students to have this cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity. And so she structures them that way. And so a lot of the work around reflection talks about, this is kind of a very quick way to describe it, but they talk about getting students from a current state to a preferred state. And so that's this idea of what's going on, so what, and then now what are you going to do? So I'll give you the example that Ruth has used in some of their classes. She used to ask students about behavioral norms and just say, what do you notice about how people behave differently in this culture? Describe it. Now she gives them really a paragraph. Notice people's attitudes about how people think about time, personal space, how to treat foreigners, or just general notions of what is right or wrong. Pay attention to how people respond to inappropriate behavior. Note what clues you use to figure out the attitudes of people in the new place. And then she has 3 prompts. Describe the attitudes you noticed, compare what you have learned with your assumptions before you came, and third, explain the insights this critique has given you about your new culture and how you need to behave. So this is one pretty simple example of really using these kinds of prompts, where it's first describe what you've got, now so what? Now tie it into your previous expectations, and she has them reflect beforehand on their assumptions. And then what does this mean to you about how you should behave in this new culture? So it's really taking the reflection and putting it on them as opposed to just focusing on the differences there. Another example I'll give you is from the University of Arizona has a program called SOAR, where they have college students that go into middle schools, usually in pretty underrepresented school or underprivileged schools, and work with students there. And this is another example where the woman who ran that program used to talk about how she'd get pretty ethnocentric kind of responses to this, that the students would go out and say, wow, these kids really need a lot of work, and I'm there to kind of save the day, and I'm the knight in shining armor sort of thing, which wasn't, again, the purpose of this experiential learning activity. The purpose was to get the students out there, hopefully make a difference, but also for the college students to really learn. And so she really restructured the prompts around this same idea. They use a concept called funds of knowledge, if you've heard of that, and it's a way to kind of look at what everybody brings to an educational experience. So the idea that maybe you don't have a lot of college level or specific science or math type classes, but you've experienced the world. You've been in a kitchen, you've mixed ingredients, you've worked with numbers in some way. So everybody comes to a learning experience with some kind of knowledge. And so the prompts that they would give their students were really more focused on what are these students bringing to the learning experience? Not what are they missing, but what is it that they're bringing? How can you capitalize on that? So what do you notice? how do you look at that within this funds of knowledge theory? And then now what are you going to do about it now that you see this as an opportunity as opposed to a gap? So structuring reflection based on what you're going for and how you can get students to work through this is essentially one of the keys there. So again, kind of the idea of orienting, guiding students and providing this ongoing reflection are really sort of the basis of this idea of experiential learning. And so I know a lot of you, there were hands raised that do some of this work. So I would, again, love to hear if any of you can share maybe some of what you're doing, either in classes, or I don't know at this campus if it's more service learning and study abroad kind of things, or if you're doing things in your classes, but would love to hear some examples of your experiential learning, or perhaps how you help structure students reflect on their experiences.
I have students, I teach creative writing and literature, and I have students that collaborate with other humanities classes. And so I would just emphasize the point about how the first time you do something like that, you often don't know about the preparation that it will take or how to orient them until you're in the middle of it. Because the second time that I did it, it went so much better. And my collaborating teacher, they would be in the middle of doing something, and we would look at each other and say, we really should have told them about that before they started doing it. So I appreciate that point quite a bit. And the more it'll be the third time I've done a similar project in the spring. And I find that the more I build reflection into the process, instead of just waiting for it to be at the very end, that has really made a difference, because then they seem to be more invested as they go along, instead of just, sort of having this one big thing at the end, this reflective statement at the end of the project or whatever. Having kind of mini reflections as we go has been really useful.
Yeah, that idea of ongoing reflection is definitely a key point of that. Were you going to share too?
I have experience, but for the experiential learning, I'm teaching soil science, and then we have what we call soil judging contest or soil contest. So people just think when they think about soil is only like soil, just the surface. But actually when we talk about soil, it's like the whole soil profile or soil figure. And then we have to dig a pit up to 150 centimeters. And then 5 students can go into that pit and then see how different, like soil color and soil structure, soil texture. And then we have like that class. So just go to the field every week, and then we have contests, Southeastern and national. And in fact, this week we have Southeastern soil judging contest in MSU. So this is our first day. So we have about 120 students from all over United States come here to judge 16 pits. So that's one
Wow.
experiential learning. And then after that, they have to write a reflection, what they learn, and then what kind of soil, because they think that soil is just something to grow plants. But here they will learn like how old is the soil? Is that old soil or young soil? And then if young soil is just so pretty or not, something like that. And then also they will learn like how good or how bad is our soil. Like for example, how good is the soil from Virginia? And then how about the soil from Murray here? Is that good or bad? And then if good is good for who? For what? Like is that for rice or for corn? Because it's just very, sometimes it's very subjective. So students will reflect what they learn in different states. And that's happen every year.
Yeah, that's a great example. Hopefully everybody could hear that too. But I mean, think of the difference between, you could certainly tell them all of that, right? You could tell them, here's the difference between all these soil samples and here's what's important. But by them engaging in that, going out and digging it, being involved in a contest around it, comparing it across the country, I mean, just that getting involved in it at that level is such a different experience than having read it or heard about it somewhere else. So that's a great example. What other things?
About journaling, that's something as the students are going through each has to be, you have to orient them to how to do that as well. They just can't sit down and just, what did I learn today? That becomes just describing your day versus how have you moved in your thinking.
Yeah, and that's a good point, kind of the difference. I mean, obviously you want it, back to your point, this idea of continual ongoing reflection being much better than just sort of doing it once with an experiment or with an experience. But the difference too between kind of very structured versus very open-ended. And there's honestly some debate out there. There are certainly people who say, you know, I just really want their thoughts. I want this kind of free writing and to be able to let them share whatever they want to share. But I think that's where we also get into the danger of this kind of narrow thinking. So the structured prompts are really helpful. Maybe there can even be some of both, but giving them kind of that structure around here's where I want you to be heading with this reflection can be really helpful. And sometimes the question comes up too about how do we grade this? You know, how do you grade reflection? What's a good reflection or a bad reflection? A lot of people tend to do more of like the check, you know, kind of check minus, check plus sort of thing, that if you do it, you get points. But there are ways to get at the quality too. I know some people will do, like, you write a journal entry every week, and then at the end, I want you to pull your 3 best journal entries or your 3 best reflections, and then write kind of a meta reflection about those. Or you might have the chance to revise, you know, go back to something that happened 10 weeks ago, and now that you've had this other experience, bring that forth and then write another reflection on that reflection. And that's more graded as like a paper as opposed to what you want to do. Because you want to give them the ability to just say what they're thinking, even if it's not necessarily exactly what you hope they're thinking. But there can be ways to also look at the quality and grade for that as well. Any other experiential learning examples, questions?
In the biology department, I feel like we have trouble sometimes coming up with reasons to reflect or figuring out how to make it fit with some of our really content-based classes. But I taught conservation biology this summer, and it was a nice setup where it was all day long for a couple days a week, so we could really go out in the field and do stuff. And I think it was last year's fall forum that was about reflection, so I had some
Okay.
information to get me started. And I did use reflection on a lot of different class days, and I felt like they got better at doing it. And we had one big trip where we did role playing at a refuge, and the manager asked them to, you know, they prepared a lot, and then they were asked to act in their roles as refuge managers while we were there at different sites, and it really helped, I think, to follow that up with some reflection, because they were kind of put on the spot, or they had to do some decision making in their role.
Great. Yeah, so you guys have had experience with reflection. I don't know if anybody's tried out. I was looking for an example and I didn't find one before we left, but we've had a lot of our students do digital storytelling as a form of reflection, where they kind of create a little, usually like a 2-minute video. It's popular with, for example, a lot of study abroad programs, where instead of just, here's my slideshow about, you know, all the cool things I did, it usually has a message and a story, and kind of here's one big change that happened in me, or here's one lesson that I really learned. And they put together a little video that shows images that helps them explain that story or that message. But people that have worked on that have said it's really not about the video or creating it. It's really about creating that message, that thing that happened to them, that change that they felt. And that's the beauty of getting them to do it. But the students really love putting together these little videos then that they can show to everybody. Any other examples of? I'm good at the waiting. Okay. Well, that, I wanted to make sure we had some time for questions too. I know we're nearing the end of our time, but this was really the quick and dirty of some of these 2 ideas. But if you have other questions for me, I'm here, or I'm happy to share some of them now. But yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about graveness as a role in classrooms and all that, and I mean, I believe that, but I think we're in kind of a different place these days. You know, you use the word trigger there, and when we're told that trigger warnings and
Yeah, that's,
I could name any number of situations in our college. I know a colleague right now is going through some of this in a big way, you know, and even classes like, say, humanities. Well, the last time I taught, and I haven't taught in a while, but humanities and had the Quran, and I mean, it's a whole different world these days, bringing up certain issues like, and then also I think, you know, if you look at what's going on with our presidential campaign now, I mean, discussion doesn't mean what it used to mean. You know, discussion can mean getting in the room and screaming the loudest. I mean, certain people think that way. And then another question I have about this brave classroom, I feel like things have changed at Murray State over the years too, because partly because we have different students who, you know, like maybe have mental illness problems or whatever, and you bring up some issue, you can get a whole scene that you don't want to, you know, I mean, it's like one student versus the whole rest of the student. Even somebody who's very experienced, you know, it can be very difficult to negotiate all this. It's just not, that, I mean, I'm just feeling this great sense of nostalgia there when we went through because I feel like that was the old world in some ways.
yeah, no, that's a really good point. I actually didn't make that connection either with trigger warnings and the triggering until you said that. And I saw on some of the tables that you're having some discussions around trigger warnings, which is great. We're honestly doing that at our university too, and just at a very beginning stage of what do we even do about this? What are the norms? And there's so many different even definitions of what a trigger warning is or what it could mean. So I certainly don't have the answer on that one, but I think, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it is. And again, that's where some of the thinking and the conversations around safe space have gone, is it really, you know, again, if it's so safe that nobody's ever challenged to be out of their comfort zone, then does learning occur? But at the same time, we have lots of different students in all of our classes with lots of different situations. And how do we work with that in a way that it's pushing people enough but not too much? And again, depending on what you teach, there are certainly very controversial types of topics and some that aren't, but that also could be. We've had some sessions around kind of handling hot moments in the classroom, because sometimes that can happen where something will bubble up. And we actually did a big survey of all of our students around campus climate issues and some other things. And the message, unfortunately, that the students were bringing up is that they really expected the instructor to kind of to manage the classroom in that way, that it's kind of a new role for a lot of us in terms of teaching, is how do we not only manage the learning and the cognitive processing we want to happen, but the emotional aspects and all the differences that our students are bringing. So we've started working a little bit more around some of those management issues. How do you handle a hot moment? And it kind of gets back to conflict management and therapy type issues where you want to, you know, focus on the problem. And there's some things you can go through. There's one like, was it open the front door or something, where it's like, here's what I observe, here's what I think is happening, here's what I feel. Right now I'm feeling very uncomfortable because I'm observing a lot of people have their hands crossed and are feeling really concerned about something that was just said. So I think we want to take a minute and free write, or I want to, you know, pause the discussion and go back, or so there's lots of different ways to go about doing it depending on what happened, but it brings up a whole new realm for the instructor for sure. And I don't have the simple, easy answer for this, but I think it is something that our students expect us to manage in the classroom, and we do want to have those discussions. We do want to talk about these things, but how do we do it in a way that's civil yet also meaningful? What's the balance? I don't know, but that's where I'm striving as well. Yeah.
I don't know that there is an answer. It's just been on my mind because of that shooting in Oregon recently, and I seem to have some
Yeah.
questions asked.
Yeah. And hopefully, I mean, I think you probably do this too. This is way off topic, but you know, we've had a lot of our mental health professionals work with faculty, talking about how a lot of mental health issues come about really between the ages of like 18 and 24. So a lot of times faculty members are the first ones that see that. And again, not to add more to all of our plates, but I'm sure you probably do some of this here, but really kind of looking for certain warning signs, dramatic changes in behavior, really aggressive comments or marks that students might write in a journal or in an assignment, that those things on our campus at least, we're really encouraged to kind of be reporting those to a central place so they can look for patterns and look for that, because unfortunately, a lot of students are not with their peers, are a little bit scattered, their family may not be with them, so faculty members are almost that first line of defense sometimes in looking for that. And I realize that's taking us a totally different direction, but within discussions, that is something that comes up, these emotions, these feelings, these differences. I'm a big fan too of spending my classes have a lot of discussion, so I spend a whole lot of time at the beginning on the class norms and have the students help create those. And even if things are going great, every couple weeks I bring those back up and I say, let's revisit and let's make sure we're doing a really good job. And actually we're on a quarter system, so we're on week 5, so I just gave myself a reminder yesterday that I actually have the students kind of self-assess themselves according to the norms. Like, here's the norms that you guys created for the class. How do you think you're doing? Are you giving enough air and space to other viewpoints? Are you judging people a little bit too quickly before hearing them out? Because they come up with these great things at the beginning, but then as you start talking, it's natural for us to just kind of be pushing our views. So I really try to push those norms a lot. And have the students self-assess, and then I can give them my feedback. If they say, I'm doing great, that's a chance for me to say, well, I'm noticing that you might be jumping in a little too quickly when other people are disagreeing with you, and that's something to reflect on, just as a way to kind of keep the balance there.
I'm currently in a stage of reflective moment.
Yeah.
All of these comments and great ideas. So I feel like I need to do something differently in my class to make it better. But I'm afraid I'm just thinking about it right now. 2 weeks from now, I'm forgetting, just buried in the things that I'm doing. Do you have any advice on so that I may make a change in my courses and stuff? What would help me to make that change?
Start small would be, maybe an easy way to look at this. We actually had James Lang, who writes for the Chronicle, come out to our campus last year, and he kind of gave this great pitch about, what did he call it? Of course, there's this catchy name that now I can't remember, but it's really about, how very small changes can make a big difference in classes. So again, if you look at the sheet, not to push my agenda, but if there are certain things that maybe you reflect on and you say, I really want my students to be doing more of this than I feel like they're doing, maybe pick one of those things and say, how can I either incorporate another activity in the next 2 weeks that focuses on that, or how can I maybe just be more intentional about getting that message across? Like what we talked about this morning, this idea of problem solving and decision making. I gave an example from my class where I realized that I was teaching a class that was about decision making, and it was about this model that I gave them, but they didn't always get it by the end. And so the only change I did was to really focus every week on this model and where we were and how everything we do relates to it, and showing and comparing and contrasting different examples of how this model works. And I didn't really change what I taught or what I did. I just changed my focus and the way I talked about them. And I saw a big change when I used that approach for this one particular method. So without knowing a lot about your classes, I would say maybe pick something small, pick something that you feel like you're not getting enough of, and try to figure out a way to really focus on that over the next 2 weeks. Might be an idea. Other thoughts? Okay, I know we were about at time and it stopped raining, so thank you for sharing your ideas and your questions and concerns, and best of luck moving forward. Thanks.